Welcome to I Guess I'll Do It with Pat House. I am Pat House, and on this podcast I will talk to mostly comedians, but probably some musicians and other creative people as well about their early influences, what got them to where they are today, and when they had their I Guess I'll Do It moment where they decided to dive into their creative endeavor. So thank you for listening, and here we go. All right, on this next episode of I Guess I'll Do It with Pat House, I have my buddy Josh Gondelman. It's been a while. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thank you for having me. Great to talk with you.
Dude, thank you for being here. Lots of good things going on lately. Now, you have your own podcast called Make My Day.
True.
You have a new book called Nice Try, which is awesome.
Thank you.
Also, Deezes and Miro on Showtime, man. That's awesome. So you
got
a lot of cool shit in the pocket right now.
Yeah, it's been a really nice year or so of getting to do some fun career stuff, even while the last year in the world has been a terrifying indoor nightmare.
That's exactly terrifying indoor nightmare. That would be 2020's motto if bumper stickers were sold. Mm-hmm. So we've been buddies for a while, even though we haven't seen each other in a long time, because that's how comedy works. But we met here in Philly, 10, 12 years ago at a tiny theater show.
Yeah.
The Walking Fish, I think it was called.
That's right.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, Dave Walk used to run that show. I remember that. And I remember you coming down for that. But you started in Boston, correct?
I did. I started, I'm from there, and I started stand-up after my freshman year in college and at the clubs around the city. Yeah. So one called Dick Doherty's Beantown Comedy Vault, which was in the theater district and has since closed, and the Comedy Studio in Cambridge. And then little by little, the kind of outlying comedy clubs and Elks Lodge shows and little alternative shows. And I loved the comedy scene in Boston. I really miss home. I don't get to go that much, and this year obviously less than usual.
Oh god, yeah. And Boston has such an insane history of comics too. I mean, you and I could go back and forth the next half hour with insane Boston comics. But so I'm in the same boat as you. I started right after my freshman year of college.
Oh, cool.
So were you a comedy? I hate the phrase comedy nerd. I really do. But were you a comedy nerd in high school? Were you obsessed with stand-up or comedy movies or anything of that kind?
I was a big fan for sure. Yeah, I feel like comedy nerd, not that it's derogatory, I just don't feel like I can lay claim to it as a completist. But I do remember really the Comedy Central Presents, I believe, started when I was starting high school, maybe, or the end of middle school.
Yep,
and I
100%.
I remember because we're about the same age. I remember watching Hedberg for me was the big present. Hedberg, maybe Attell, Gaffigan, Todd Barry. I remember Wanda Sykes, and those to me, even at the time, I was these must be the most famous comedians, and that had the same resonance to me as I remember watching Chris Rock's Roll with the New special.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the one? Yeah. Or maybe that was the album based on the special. But I remember seeing that and hearing the album and just being this is great. But it didn't occur to me that he was a bigger deal than Mitch Hedberg at the time. Because I was oh, they're on TV. They must be famous. I don't know better.
Yeah, you didn't know levels at the time.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It was all, and I think that's how a lot of people were, especially, I mean, less now, just because I feel there's so much to demystify who's doing what and what means what to whom with podcasts and so many kind of behind the scenes of comedy shows over the last few years.
Yeah. Dude, that's so crazy. You mentioned the Presents. I was just talking about this in the last episode with Ted Alexandro. I talk about his because I was obsessed with his before I
loved
started
Ted's
doing
Presents.
stand-up.
Yeah.
Oh my god, I spent 5 minutes talking about how I still quote a bagel and a grape.
Oh, so good.
I talk about that bit all the time. But I was obsessed with those in high school, and I remember you mentioned all the ones Attell, Wanda Sykes. Was also Jim Gaffigan and Brian Regan and Daniel Tosh. And all of them,
Regan
exploded from. Oh yeah. I could probably still quote the Brian Regan one to this day.
For sure. I mean, I also at that time, I was I had a real, not that you grow out of it necessarily, but got really into a Carlin phase when I was an early teen too, and would buy the specials as albums, on CD and listen to them. And that started, I think, because when my uncle passed away in 1998, I think 98, he had all these VHS cassettes that, I mean, this is like really dating myself, that he had just taped off of HBO. And
Oh
so I
God, yeah.
watched like old Carlin specials that he had just taped off of TV. And I was like, this rules. This is the coolest. So it didn't occur to me that there were other people that didn't do that. And then now looking back, I'm like, oh, I guess I was kind of a comedy nerd, but like I had a comedy appreciating family in terms of like, we would watch like occasionally like SNL or SNL compilation shows together, or comedy movies my dad would show me when I was young, like especially like when more stuff was on, or maybe more frequently you would watch stuff just on like network TV, like Blazing Saddles played on channel 56, and
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you could kind of like show that to a kid because it was all when I was 10 or whatever, because it was all cut for network TV.
Dude, I think I still have my the copy of Monty Python and the Holy Grail I taped off Comedy Central at midnight.
They would play it constantly
from like 7th and 8th grade.
There was so much. I mean, like Comedy Central at that time, I don't know how popular it was big picture, but I mean, that Dana Carvey special that was always on, I remember having seen like 1,000 times.
Oh God, Choppin' Broccoli and Frame OJ.
Choppin' Broccoli, all that stuff. He had that long OJ chunk about like judicial system, just like talking about how you always sound drunk saying judicial system. Like there's just so much there that's like still kind of like kicking around in my brain. And then there, a few movies that like aren't even necessarily great movies, but I just saw them because they were just on TV all the time and there weren't as many options. Like I've seen Airheads so many times just because that was always on Comedy Central when I was like at an age where I would come home from school and just like watch TV.
Dude, I feel like I'm interviewing myself because that is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I still find myself going, yeah, but he still can't grow hair on his balls.
Yeah.
There's so many lines in that movie. But I couldn't watch the Chris Farley nipple scene. I always had to turn away. Oh, and you just go, improvise. Couldn't watch it. Could not bring myself to do it.
That's so funny. I always think of like, next time we be Pip farting on a snare drum. And Adam Sandler just goes, hey, I ain't farting on no snare drum. There's just so many. It's just like I just remember that movie. Like my recollection of that movie is probably so disproportionate to its broader cultural impact, just because it was so readily available to me at a time when I was like so impressionable with regard to entertainment.
Have you seen it recently?
No, I haven't watched it in like, truly, it's probably been like 17 years.
I'm probably in the same boat. But that's one thing, if I can ever work a joke or any sort of line in conversation where I could say like a football helmet full of cottage cheese.
Yes. Yep.
Naked pictures of B. Arthur. I will find a way to work that in there just to see people's reaction.
It's great.
And they have no idea where it came from. 10 times out of 10, the reference is way over their heads.
Yeah, that's so funny. That's their like their list of demands, right? As hostage negotiators.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it's the best. So, did you see live shows on campus before you started?
I did. I must have. Let me think about who was there. I think I probably saw a couple live I think I probably saw a couple live shows. I don't remember. I remember more the ones that I ended up opening for. Like early on, I got to work with some really cool people. I got to open for Christian Finnegan on campus and Eugene Mirman. Yeah. So like real fun. And that's the kind of thing you get when you're like the second, like I had one friend, my friend Dan Hirschon, who was doing stand-up and was a senior.
I know Dan.
Yeah. And then he graduated and he mostly is like a filmmaker now. Writer, producer, film director. And I remember like seeing him and being like, oh, he's really funny. And then starting to do it like kind of, I did like one thing maybe on campus at the very end of freshman year, and then started doing stuff like at comedy clubs and open mics over the summer. And then when I came back, I would get the opportunities that like Dan had been getting the couple of years before, of just like, oh, this is the person who does stand up on campus, so they can open the stand up show.
Oh my God, that's so funny, because for the 10th time in the past 10 minutes, I was in the same boat. Temple had a couple comics, but most of them were already like a little more experienced than me, but not in the area anymore. So once I made it known that I had like, geez, I was about to call it a good 10, but I'm sure it was a mediocre 5 and a passable 5.
Oh yeah. I mean, the sets I was doing, like, I'm sure if I looked back at them now, I would have been like, they should have let me do that once and then never again.
Yeah, exactly. But they would let me open a handful of these shows on campus, and it was really fun. I remember doing really well, but in the same boat, I actually remember bombing one really bad too. But the first time I got the phone call to actually host one, I got to do 10 minutes in front of Drew Frazier, and I think they gave me $100, and I was like over the moon. I had my picture on his poster all over campus, and I was like, this
Oh,
is
that's so
so
exciting.
surreal. Yeah, it was very, very bizarre. And I guess that was like my first real college gig. But luckily that was the one that went well. I've
Oh,
done other
good.
shows where I would sometimes I would fill in at the last possible second as an opener and then just like eat it. And then I would like not, I wouldn't tell the crowd I went to Temple and hope nobody would recognize me.
Oh, that's so funny.
Do
That's
you
really
remember any
funny.
of the first jokes you told?
Gosh. Um yeah, I had one cuz my hair started thinning really young, so I would always say this is just such like a little, it's not a great joke, but I would open with I what was I going to say? Oh, it was like I think it's positive you starting to lose your hair early because you save all this money on shampoo and haircuts and dating. Was like kind of the little opener, and then
Absolutely.
I had this horrible joke. My friend Sean Sullivan, who's such a funny comedian, who's based in Boston, and I've known him for, since I started. Basically, I had this joke that was like, it was like I don't know why I even wrote it. Like I don't know what put it in my head, but it was like, oh, you know what it was? It was it was right when they remade Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And so it was like if Willy Wonka maybe there was some rumor that Christopher Walken was supposed to be in it. And so it was like if Christopher Walken played Willy Wonka or something. And so it's just like that was that era where like everyone did Christopher Walken for some reason because he's got a real
Oh
funny
yeah.
cadence. So it's like, Charlie, the snozberries taste like snozberries. And it's just like it's not a good joke, but I remember it like, it worked fine. um but yeah, I was like, I had some pretty rocky stuff back in the day.
Oh God, of course. That's the only way to get better is to just
Hmm.
push through that. But it's so funny that you said you save money on, what do you say, haircuts,
Shampoo and
shampoo,
haircuts and
and
dating. Yeah.
dating. Every comic had that joke of 3 when they
Yep.
first start. I feel
Yep.
like every single one had the 1, 2, and 3 as the punchline. I'm definitely guilty of that, probably numerous times as well early in
Well, I
my
mean,
career.
it's such a classic structure and it works, and it's like legit, like the rule of threes people say is like a real comedy cadence, and I think it's true. It like sets up the expectation, confirms it, and then breaks it. But yeah, I think there are so many jokes that you hear someone do early on where like you see the skeleton of it too visibly, like it's like watching the x-ray of a joke where it's like first example, second example, oh get ready, third funny example.
And then I think a lot of times when it's early in your career, you think the third example is such misdirection, but it's really not.
Yeah, it's like right,
Like there's
it's like
definitely
10% funnier than just the regular examples.
exactly the crowd's probably like, yeah, we kind of saw that one coming. We didn't know
Yes.
what word you were going to use, but we
Yep.
were in the ballpark.
Yeah, it's I love that Andy Kindler line about like do setting up a joke like that and then going, and a third thing that's funnier than the other two as the
Abs-
punchline. It's like such a perfect like deconstruction of that structure.
Do you remember the specific moment where you're like, man, I just want to try stand up? I don't care if it goes well. I'm not looking to make a career out of this. I just want to get on stage and just try these crazy ideas I have.
Yeah, it didn't occur to me that anyone had a career at it. Like, I would see people on TV and be like, well, those are famous people. And then I was like, well, I know there are places like on campus, or that's where it was at first. My friend did through like a little event in our hometown. And so uh, I did stand up at one of those, maybe two of those. And I think I did okay the first time and bombed the second time, and then did one thing on campus. And then I had a friend who was doing open mics in the city in Boston, because I grew up in the suburbs, and our mutual friends were just like, hey, Joe's doing it, why don't you do it? If he can do it, why can't you do it? Like, you talk about want to do it, so why don't you do it? So I say I got bullied into my whole career.
Yeah, you you,
By
you got compared into it. Well, if
I
Joe can
did.
do it,
Yeah, if Joe could do it, you could do it. Not, and not, it wasn't like, oh, Joe's a slob, but it was like, well, he's doing it. Like, so why don't you just do it? You know what I mean? Like, what are you, a loser? And so that's how I started. But I agree. It like didn't occur to me at first. Like, I didn't know anything different than, okay, you can do an open mic or you're a famous touring comedian.
Yeah, you didn't see like the disparity between the two at the time.
Or I didn't see the path between the two.
Yeah,
I just knew that like both of those things existed, and I didn't realize there were like, okay, these people tour a lot of colleges but don't really play clubs, or these people play clubs and don't do colleges, or these people there's a set of comics probably in every city that works regionally or locally.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
And that's so much of who does stand up, and even at a professional level. But yeah, it just didn't, like, I had no idea the spectrum of like working comedy at the time.
That's funny you say that, because you're absolutely right, because I didn't either, obviously, when I first started. And then you don't really realize the weird avenues it does take. Like, I remember I was opening for Tom Segura in Florida, and the host that week, this is years ago because he's doing theaters now, but was like, there are so many comics who just make a living doing comedy in Florida. And I'm like, holy
Totally.
shit. Like I knew there was, club comics, college comics, yada, 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 road dogs, but I didn't realize this being specific to just one state like blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, just comics? He's like, they never leave the state and they make a living doing comedy here. And I'm like, that's insanely specific.
It's so specific. I mean, growing up and growing up in New England and growing up in comedy in New England, there's like a real strong regional scene. Like, it's a lot of Boston, but it's also like the comics in Boston do a lot of the work in New Hampshire and Vermont, and or it's like the comics from New Hampshire will do the Boston clubs too, but like not really go further south than Rhode Island, Connecticut, or further west than like upstate New York. And that's not like a knock on them. That's just because if you can work without having to go more than like 3 hours from home, 5 hours from home for your furthest gigs, like, that's great. That means you can have a family and drive to everything and not have to get in a plane week after week. Like, I think, not that that was like the trajectory I was trying to go on, but I was also like, oh, this is cool. There's like people that are like doing this at a really high level that you don't necessarily see on TV. And I think that scene was so strong, especially like there are people there that have been doing it for 35 years. Like, Tony V is incredible. One of the best headliners.
Oh my God. Don Gavin.
I mean, rest in peace, Kevin Knox, who he would host this open mic at he was a headliner. He was an actor, but I think mostly around New England for at least the last part of his life. And he would host this open mic in this giant comedy club. It was probably 450 seats in Faneuil Hall, in the kind of big touristy part of downtown Boston. And it would, sometimes there would be like 40 people in this giant room, and just like watching him like bring it to 40 people was like such an instructive lesson. He wasn't like too cool for it. He wasn't over it. He was like, I'm here, I'm working, it's Monday night, there's 40 people here, and I'm gonna give them a show. Especially because so many of the other people on the show were like really new to comedy, and so there'd be some other working pros filling up the show, but it would probably be 4 or 5 people who maybe had done it once or twice before. So he was like, I have to be the show for these people.
Carry the weight. Yep. Yeah. Pick up the excess and carry the weight. Now, you just reminded me of something, and I want to say I had the conversation with you, because outside of you, I don't think I knew too many Boston comics, 10, 12 years ago. Because I remember, like, when I started to, like, travel a little bit. Now, I'm in Philly, so I would do New Jersey, Baltimore, like Central PA, like not travel, but, gigs 2 to 3 hours away I would start to get. But Boston was never a nut I even like understood to crack. It felt like Boston was just like all Boston comics. And like what you just said, like a lot of Boston comics did like New Hampshire and Vermont. That makes a lot more sense now. Was the scene like always inside like that? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a great question.
Because I like would go to New York. I would go to a ton of places, but I've only done Boston twice. But it just seemed like it wasn't even an option because as an amateur outsider in Philadelphia, I didn't even know where to begin. And honestly, outside of you, I don't even know who I would have even spoken to.
Yeah, it's maybe a little less now the last few years because there have been more kind of people putting up, like starting rooms on their own that were like not clubs necessarily, like a little more alternative venue stuff. Rob Crean had I think the venue's closing though, but like had a long running Friday night show that you could get on, and like depending on who you knew, if you knew someone that was doing really well in the scene, you could get Rick Jenkins maybe to put you up at the Comedy Studio. But like when I started, other than the studio, which was like pretty picky, and you need some like heavy recommendations to get in as like an outsider with a outsider from outside New England with like without heavy credits and stuff. It was really tough. Like there were a bunch of clubs that mostly worked people from within the state and the area. So there was Nick's, there were the Vault. Dick Doherty always had a couple of rooms like outside the city in the suburbs at like a Ramada function room on a Friday night or something. And it was all local and localish people. There was the Comedy Connection, which I brought up earlier, the big club. But even that, unless a headliner brought you with them to be an opening act, it wasn't like you could crack it as like, I'm a working traveling comedian that's not a national headliner, right? Like I would be the feature, the middle act on a show doing 25 minutes. You couldn't really pitch the clubs in New England because they go like, we've got our guys already. Like,
absolutely.
Why do we need you? We have guys that are great. And I say guys, there were like a couple of women, that were working at that level at the time. And I think a few more now probably that are really great. Also like Kelly McFarland, who I work with.
Oh yeah. I've met her at the Boston Comedy Festival before.
Yeah. So great. But like she was the woman I remember who was like doing the most like featuring on bigger shows and headlining the local shows when I started. But like, they would go, we have our guys and we have a guy who's we know is going to kill, we know works for our crowds in this room, and we don't have to pay for his hotel because he's going to drive 25 minutes outside the city and, sleep in his own bed at night.
And so be home. Yep.
Yeah. So it was but as a comic, when there would be the Boston Comedy Festival once a year in the fall, I would like crave seeing outside people that weren't, the big headliners necessarily. Because I feel like there was something about seeing people who were like just breaking out that felt a little less daunting than, oh, you maybe go to the Connection and you watch Christopher Titus, do a sold out show. And I think I got to talk to him for like 15 minutes after a show because my buddy Mike Kaplan was opening for him. And, not that he was an unapproachable dude, but just like as just a random comic hanging out, you don't always get to socialize with the people coming through. But during the Boston Comedy Festival, everybody just hung out for a week. It was a competition. So it was like intense, and everybody was curious and wanted to know how the shows were going. And you would meet other people like newly working comics or headliners that didn't have like huge credits and specials. And it was very exciting. I mean, I met some like really great people just through that, like Ryan Hamilton I met when he would come through for that. I'm like, just really cool people. And like, that's when I would see the most folks, but it's not like in New York, there's just people always kind of passing through, visiting from other cities, doing shows with their friends who have moved here from their home scenes, other headliners, LA friends, Boston people will come down. But yeah, in Boston, I think there was a while where there weren't like mid-sized rooms. Like there was a room called Motley's that was run by some friends for a while. I really loved that room. I recorded my first album there, and they would bring in like Hari Kondabolu before he was doing clubs. A lot of the time would come to do Motley, or, before he was doing like A clubs and theaters now, would do Motley's, and like you'd get to work with some really cool people. But like there were periods where there was no time to like work with emerging headliners, which was like a weird experience.
Yeah, I understand that because just to tag along to what you said, I started doing comedy a little bit before Helium opened. So I understand that excitement about like we did have bigger names come through, or maybe they weren't bigger at the time. Maybe I just worshipped them personally. But I remember the first time like Dave Attell and Greg Giraldo or like Laurie Kilmartin came through Helium. And I'm like, holy shit, these people I idolized are now coming here. But on the flip side, and I was just talking with this about Ted Alexandro on the other day. So when Ted came through to headline Helium, he was there like the first month or two they opened, one of the first headliners. And he told me he'd only been doing stand-up maybe 6 or 7 years at that point. And I thought he was like a 20-year vet in the game. And I'm like, holy shit, 6 years in. I've been doing stand-up for 16 years now. So my perspective was blown 3 days ago when Ted told me that.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that's like so wild to me. Because that's how I feel too. I've been doing it. I think we must have started right around the same time. And I've been doing it for like 16 years. And it is, I like, when it's possible to go out and do it more, I like am out most nights a week. I do a lot of sets for somebody that I think like isn't a full-time touring comic. Like I really take a lot of pride in like staying in fighting shape with stand-up. But it's to have been doing it for like 16 years is really like a wild point of view to have, especially when like when we would work with headliners as younger comics, right? And you'd open for someone or see them, and like sometimes they were people that had already been doing it 20 years, and then sometimes they're only 5-8 years in, and you're like, oh wow, I wish I could look back on them, on those performances with my current perspective. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Isn't that the Faces? I wish I knew then what I know now.
Yeah.
So,
but some of that stuff is like when you would watch Dave Attell's specials at that time in like 2000, like he'd probably been doing it a little longer than.
Yeah, I think he was like late 80s.
Yeah.
I think he was just like towards the end of the boom. I remember I asked him one time, and I think he said he started around like 88, 89.
Wow.
He didn't know, but he just ballparked it at like very late 80s.
But I think then on the other hand, if Gaffigan had a special in 2000, 2001, I don't think he'd been doing it quite as long, right? Like he probably started in the 90s, and like, oh shoot. And now he's just like I remember watching his presents and being like, oh, this is one of the best people. And that special is great. But then now you watch him and you're like, oh, he's like the guy, like an international superstar.
Yeah, and I always wondered if, like, when these people like Gaffigan or somebody new-ish is taping their presents, if they're like, I don't really know what I'm doing.
Yeah,
like
I heard 40 minutes. I heard somewhere that Maria Bamford, when she shot her half hour, it was like one of the first times she'd ever done a half hour of comedy.
That is bananas.
Yeah, and it's great. It's like legendary. That's another one that I remember seeing and being like, this person is a genius from space.
Yeah. Space or Minnesota.
Yes, that's true. I'd never been to either place at the time.
Oh, well, I've never been to either yet. So, just two more quick things and I'll wrap it up here. Was Boston a tough scene to start in? Because I feel like people said that about Philly, but then being in Philly, I heard that about Boston. Were crowds just like tougher? Was it like a you better fucking make me laugh kind of thing?
I think one thing that I liked about starting there was that you could play any kind of room. Like if you were like, oh, I perform comedy for nightclub audiences that are drinking and are like coming into the city for date night from the suburbs, you could work plenty of those rooms. And if you were the kind of person who was like, I want to kind of do these like short sets, working on like material for audiences that are a little like a little more, oh, these people are like in the neighborhood in Cambridge or Boston, and they're coming out for the night because they know this is like the hip room to check out a show at.
Yeah.
Like, you could have those audiences too. And if you wanted to like perform at like youth hockey fundraisers and make a little money and like really like go out and have to like, oh, this is like parents are paying money to, this is like their night out and you're in their community, like all of that kind of stuff was on the table. And I really,
same here.
Yes,
same here in Philly in the suburbs.
And I don't know if you get that experience everywhere, but I know that I got that in Boston. And then the other thing about it was that there was just enough hope, if that makes sense. Like I'm glad, and maybe if I started in New York, I would feel differently. But starting or closer to New York even, but starting in Boston, there wasn't like the sense that any day you could make it, like that, like, oh, if I have the right set tonight, I could be on the Tonight Show tomorrow. Like occasionally there would be auditions for Comedy Central or Just for Laughs or
Oh yeah.
the big festival in Montreal, or Letterman. The booker would come through occasionally.
Eddie
And so
Brill.
like, what's it, yeah, it was
Yeah.
Eddie at the time.
Yeah.
And that was, that was like exciting, so you could see people that were on that trajectory. But at the same time, it wasn't like, oh, everyone I know is getting these big breaks and I'm not, or whatever, or like, why aren't I writing for TV yet? Like there was still like occasionally someone would get kind of plucked out of the scene and get to do stuff on a bigger scale. But like by the time I did it for a long time in Boston before I moved. I was in Boston for 7 years doing stand up, like my last 3 years of college, and then 4 more years when I was teaching preschool full time. And I
That's right. You
think,
were a preschool teacher. I
yeah,
knew
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I knew that.
And I had a lot of material about it early. It was like very helpful to get to be like, kids are funny, here are examples. And it was like, it took a lot of pressure off of like joke writing to just get
Yeah.
to report funny things. But and then I had to like wean myself off that. But I do think that helped, because you're just kind of doing it. Like when you said, when I started, I just wanted to do this and see where it goes. It was a lot of that early on. A lot of like, oh, I like doing this, and I'm going to see if I can go from open mic to hosting shows professionally and getting paid. And then, okay, I'm really killing it as a host. I'm going to see if I can go from host to the middle act, right? And do like 20 to 30 minute feature spots. And by the time I was doing that pretty regularly and going out on the road a little bit, I just felt like I was at this crossroads at about 7 years, where I had done some festivals on the road and like gone out on the road. I had a college agent at that time, so I was headlining occasional colleges, and I was like, okay, I've been doing this long enough that I think if I want to do more, I have to go to New York or LA, because I was not at a point yet as a comedian where I was going to like break into the ranks. I was 26, and I was just like too green still and too young to like break into the ranks of New England headliners. Like I wasn't going to be the guy that was
Yeah.
headlining the big room at like the Kowloon, which is this giant Chinese restaurant that's had comedy forever. And it's like, I just like wasn't right for those audiences yet. And I think if I went back now and I could like, I usually have been doing Laugh Boston the last couple of years when I would go back to do like a headline weekend. But I think like I have a better ability. I'm just like a better comic than I was, 9 years ago, obviously. But at that time, I was like, okay, I don't think I'm going to make the jump that I want in my career by staying here.
Absolutely.
I have to go to New York or somewhere and see if like the stuff that I want is stuff that I'm capable of. Like I'd like to be a writer for things, and I would like to try to do stand up on television. And I just felt like for TV and stuff, there weren't numerous enough opportunities in Boston to make it feel like staying there was the smart bet. And for TV writing or like book writing and magazine writing, I could have been more attuned to like what was going on online and like trying to submit online stuff and pitch and like be part of that community. But I did, when I moved in 2011, I kind of just had like an online Twitter presence that was emerging. And then I was like around people that were writing when I moved to New York. And like, it just made everything like I wanted to be where more stuff was happening that I wanted to be a part of, if that makes sense.
Oh God, of course. And if allow me to point out another similarity between us, I also moved to New York in 2011.
Yes, I remember that.
It lasted a year. I was in Hoboken, New Jersey, but I mean, same
Right.
shit. You're there
But
for
that
the same
counts.
reason.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
I mean,
kind of.
Hoboken, New Jersey, not like it's the same, not like, oh, I grew up in Hoboken, so I grew up in New York City, but it is like for the purposes of comedy, Hoboken is like, there are places in New York City that are like equally accessible to do comedy from Hoboken, and like Bay Ridge, let's say
I
Brooklyn.
remember running into comics all the time he would like, hey, where are you going home to? And I would say Jersey, and they would like grimace or like make a face.
Yeah.
And then, but their commute was 40 minutes more than mine.
Mm-hmm.
Like Hoboken with the PATH train was so much. PATH train was so easy.
Yeah, like to get from Midtown to Hoboken was probably shorter than, or downtown even. Like I remember specifically the early on in my years in New York when UCB East opened up, which is Upright Citizens Brigade, opened a theater on the Lower East Side on Avenue A, and like to walk from there to the train and then walk along the underpass from the F train to the 1 train, and then take the 1 train from 14th Street to 137th Street where I lived. That was like, if it was late at night, like if I had gone to a show and then hung out and watched a friend go up and then had a drink to like, mingle a little bit and chat with friends, that we're talking, if I don't catch the trains, it could be 20 minutes between each train. We could be talking like an hour 20 to get home.
Absolutely.
Within the city, within Manhattan.
Yep. Even I think overnight the PATH train was at least a half an hour at its most, so I knew I was at least going to get home at a somewhat decent time still.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
2011 is when I came here.
Yeah, and then I left in 2012. So that lasted long. It was quite the year. I'm going to ask you one last question, or it's one last question, but then there'll probably be a sub talk there.
Cool. I'm ready.
Have you done the Wilbur Theater?
I have. I haven't headlined it, but I did the Wilbur once. So I worked for 5 years for Last Week Tonight with John Oliver on HBO, and my first year, I did all the social media, and like when they would do a lot of like stuff with little pop-up websites, and I would help coordinate that with the developers that worked through HBO. And but John knew that I was a stand-up, and he went to Boston to do 4 shows, New Year's Eve and New Year's Eve at the Wilbur. And when he would tour, he was pretty like scrupulous about not wanting to play favorites with people on staff, I think. So he wouldn't like bring someone to open for him that was just like, oh, this person writes for the show, I'll bring this person, because I think he didn't want to be unfair and seem like he was playing favorites. But I asked through my manager, I was like, would he let me do the Boston shows? So I went back. This was late 2014, and it was I was back for a whole week. I did Laugh Boston featuring for Jen Kirkman over Christmas, because she did Christmas shows. And then I did New Year's Eve and New Year's Eve at the Wilbur with Oliver. And they were some of my favorite shows I've ever done.
Oh God, dude. I that's exactly why I asked. Cause the Wilbur's probably, is that the best spot to perform in town if you're looking for something?
It's incredible. Yeah. I mean, it's like somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 seat theater, but the bottom is tables.
I was going to say about 11.
Yeah, the bottom and you've done more theaters than I have, I'm sure, but like it's just like such a fun setup. It's like really tight, like it doesn't go that far back, which is helpful. Like it just kind of goes up. So, and at the bottom again, I keep like starting this thought, not finishing it, but it's seating like a comedy club. Like there's tables and chairs, and then it gets into like theater seating, and so the bottom of it feels like a comedy club. And then even the very top, there's like the orchestra level, and then there are 2 balconies, or a balcony and a mezzanine, whatever they say, and none of them feel that far from you, even though it's 1,100 seats. Where like I did a show at BAM, I got to do the show that Sarah Silverman was doing for New York Comedy Festival, and it's 2,000 seats, which I guess is like, almost 50% more, but the people in the back felt so much further away that like you really the pacing between like 300 and 1,100 seats felt less different to me than the pacing between 11 and 2,000, just because of like how far people had to be from you.
Absolutely. The Wilbur has the best theater setup I've ever seen, and even on stage as the comic, it sounds like a comedy club.
Yes. The laughs come really fast. It feels like what you say hits the crowd really fast, and then their response hits you really fast.
Yeah, I did one show there. I just opened for Segura, and it was nuts because my parents actually came up for that, and they sat in the front row of the
Oh, that's
balcony.
so nice.
Oh, and so it, me and Tom were doing like a 2-person show that run. I would do like 20 to 25, and then he would do, whatever time he did. And I did like 31 or 32 and didn't even realize. And there was shit
Yep.
I didn't even do on my set list. And I just distinctly remember, like, we don't toot our own horn when we say this, but like crushing. Like the crowd was just so hot. They got all the little nuances.
Yep.
And it was, to this day, like I'm coming up on 16 years next month. To this day, I would put that in my top 3 shows of all time. Like, not like recording an album is cool,
Yeah.
had some amazing nights here and there, but something about the Wilbur was just on a different level.
Yeah, I loved it. I haven't been back since. So I guess it's been like 6 years almost. And those shows, I think about them frequently. Well, do you have a second for me to tell a little story?
Oh my
That
God, absolutely.
I've told this before, but this is like one of my truly my favorite moments in comedy is I was opening for John, and my wife was with me. She came up to spend the holidays with my family, which is very sweet. We weren't married at the time. We'd been dating I guess like 9 months. And she was like, yeah, sure. I'll come and like sleep on a sofa bed at your family's house. Very lovely of her. We, we we're hanging out in the green room. There's a little green room upstairs from the theater or from the stage. And I had one drink and the shows had been going really nicely. Like the audiences were really lovely, just getting like the kind of responses you want from a crowd. It just like, I was having so much fun on stage. And I like had started, I don't know if you ever get this way with an audience that's like, you perceive them as being too good. And I was like, I'm gonna spite them. So I went out and I said, hey, this is really nice. It was 10 o'clock on New Year's Eve. And I said, this is so nice to be here. Like I grew up just outside the city. I lived in the city for years. It's really meaningful to me to get to be in Boston doing this big show on New Year's Eve. That's so nice to be here with all you. It feels great. And they got like a round of pander applause. And I go, well, that said, I did move to New York several years ago because I wanted to be happy and successful. And the fury of the crowd immediately turning on me, hated me, were so mad. And I said, you can't be mad at me for leaving. Anyone can go away from Boston. Good Will Hunting isn't science fiction. And they hated me more. And then
that's
it was
awesome.
And yes, it was the most fun. And then I turned them around. I got like a little applause break on like my first real bit. And I was like, no, you don't get to like me now because you already made your choice. So you just sit here and listen to me. You don't get to have fun. And I wasn't like doing a bad set on purpose, but like when they clapped, I was like, I don't want your applause. You don't get to choose to like me now. And so I brought up John. I remember saying, I'd had one big glass of whiskey and I said, this is your get ready for your headliner. This was so fun. Please give him a round of applause, so enthusiastic that he feels like a fraud and doubts that he deserves any of this. Please welcome to the stage John Oliver. And John comes out and we shake hands and he just mouths, so true.
Oh, that's so funny. I actually have a quick story about my intro. Not like I said, I only did the one show there. But so Tom and I drove up from Brooklyn. We did the Bell House the night before, and we were at the Wilbur the next night.
Oh, Bell House is great too.
And we hit insane traffic. It sucked. Like, it should have taken, I don't know, 4 hours? It was like close to 6.5.
Yeah.
So I get on stage, and first thing, I've never been to Boston before. I don't know these people. They don't know me. But I riff off the top, which I never do, let alone in a theater. There's 1,100 people in the crowd. But I opened up by saying we had a really shitty, long, stressful ride from New York, and that I have an idea, and that we should bomb Connecticut. And that got thunderous applause because that is the worst state to drive through.
It is. And it's so often like I've done things in Connecticut, but I also like if you are from New England from northern New England and live in New York, so much of your experience of Connecticut is going through it. That's not Connecticut's fault. That's just where it happens to be. And so like, I feel like my perception of Connecticut is unfair because it's so often like, it's the night before Thanksgiving and I've been in the car for 4 hours and we haven't even hit New Haven yet. And I'm just like furious. The whole state feels like a parking lot.
Dude,
And that's not Connecticut's fault.
How do you come out of New York City over the GW and then shit goes down to like 2 lanes? I don't get it.
Yeah, it was rough. I take the Amtrak now. I like gave up my car a few years ago when I moved I moved in with my wife because I was living uptown. I didn't have a day job for a long time. Like I would tutor, but you know, it was here and there, so I could always move my car for street cleaning. Where I lived, everyone would just double park during street cleaning, like on the opposite side of the street, and then move their car back an hour later after the street sweepers went by. And so I could manage that on, you know, when I didn't have to like go to an office all day. And then I got an office job and accrued so many tickets. And then I moved in with my wife the next year in Brooklyn. And like my car was so old, it was like a 99 Corolla that I had until 2014. And I would have just pushed it into the sea if that wouldn't ruin the sea.
Oh, that. All right, man, dude. Thank you for sharing your story. Is there anything at all you want to plug? No, thank you for having me, man. I mean, this is so comedy nerdy. I want to talk to people about why they got into it and their first set, but I also love going off on a tangent and just shooting the shit about our common ground. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, this is a blast.
Cool, man. Thank you. Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, please. I have a podcast called Make My Day. It's a one-on-one comedy game show. So like the contestant always wins. That's been really fun to do. I've had like great guests on. Sometimes it's a 2 people playing together. So I had Jesus and Mero on. I'm trying to think. Mike Birbiglia have been on. John Hodgman. Yeah, I'm like, I have so much fun doing it. And then watch Jesus and Mero on Showtime at Sundays and Thursdays at 11. And I have a book out. It's been out for a year now, I guess. It's called Nice Try: Stories of Best Intentions and Mixed Results. And it's essays. And I would love for you to read it because it still exists even after a year.
Very cool. Well, check it out. And thanks again for being here, man.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Dude, you got it, man. We'll definitely, hopefully once this shit is over, we will cross paths soon.
I hope so.
All right, man. Thank you for listening and have a good one.